Your job as a strength, conditioning, powerlifting coach, performance coach, whatever you want to call it, is to improve performance in a given task. No matter what the sport is, no matter if it's squat, bench or deadlift, to run, to jump, whatever it is, we've generally got some objective measures that we can see that will improve performance in any of those tasks. And the way we do that is by applying the principle of specificity. You're going to do the thing to get good at the thing. I may be stating the obvious here, and we all probably know that specificity is the answer, but it is a double-edged sword. We drive too much specificity over the long term, we may not be seeing the results that we're looking for. Not enough specificity, definitely not the results we're looking for. And today, in this video, we're going to be explaining why specificity at all times is probably not the answer and what we can do to remedy this. So we've got to look at why highly specific training isn't the answer all the time. If we think of the example of the powerlifter who needs 3 attempts for squat, bench and deadlift, tapering up in intensity, getting as close as they can to their max effort or at a max effort to reach success on the platform. Training like that all the time, very, very close to failure. Training with limit weights all the time, just singles, if we're going to be really specific and take that principle at face value, it's just not the answer. It's really highly fatiguing, it's stressful to the tissues of the body, and it's probably not going to get you the results that you're looking for in the long term. If we look at another example, the MMA fighter or the boxer, for example, they need to fight at 100% intensity. They're essentially trying to take the other person's head off and ideally win by knockout. To train for that, they need to spar. Now, if we're going to compose all of our training of game speed, fight speed, the entire time, we're probably going to see there's going to be some effects that are not ideal for improved performance over the long term. And I don't think you need to be an expert in fighting to understand that. Specificity lies on a continuum, and at the other end, we have variability. Now, in the context of this, motor control uses movement variability to describe repetition without repetition. We're not talking about that today. What we're talking about is more variance in movement. So for the powerlifter who squats, a sagittal plane focused exercise where we're driving extension into position, the opposite of that would be biasing frontal plane and transverse plane and focusing on more flexion based positions. That is how we drive movement variability or movement options. In terms of systemic variability, if we think about what we're training in the powerlifter, it's a single effort, 1 rep, probably lasts 5 seconds. If we think about systemic variability from that standpoint, it would be long, lower intensity exercise like steady state cardio on an air bike, assault bike, step up, whatever you choose. So that would be at the opposite ends. One end, specificity, 1 RM strength. At the other end, variability, where we've got longer efforts. At one end of the specificity spectrum, we've got plane specific strength. And at the other end, we've got frontal and transverse planes to give us movement options. Now we're going to break down this spectrum or this continuum of specificity and variability or performance and health. And we're going to talk about how we can start to trickle in exercises, some modalities, some practices that will start to sprinkle in a little bit of variability in the long term so we can improve health and in the long term, sustain performance. So just to preface this part of the video, we are well aware that specificity comes at a cost. To see improvements in performance in the long term, we will start to see drop-offs in health markers. And that's okay. The focus of performance is to perform in a specific task. We're not looking for the powerlifter to exhibit high amounts of aerobic health and fitness when it's just not that important. We need just enough to see that they recover in between efforts and they're able to repeat performance from single to single, from set to set over the course of competition or a training session. Performance is easy to measure. In the powerlifter, it's 1 RM strength in the squat, bench or deadlift. In the bodybuilder, there'd be increases in lean body mass, decreases in body fat, and improvement in set to set performance, overall more reps per set essentially for a given weight. In the runner, that would be improved pace over their distance that they compete in. It's an objective measure of performance. And it's very, very easy to see if we're improving performance by those objective results. So this all sounds easy enough. And what I was talking about earlier with specificity, you're gonna do the thing to get good at the thing. It just makes sense to do that year round, to max effort all the time, and you'll probably get better. With the powerlifter or the strength athlete that's just practice singles and doing heavy top end strength, very close proximity to failure year round, they'll probably tell you that it's pretty fatiguing and it's very hard to sustain performance over the long term, but by hammering that top end strength. Now, in the previous video that I did on periodization, I spoke about allostasis, and allostasis is how we achieve stability through change. These deviations, so the response to stresses, whether it's through training, whether it's through life, whether it's through emotional stresses, whether it's through work stresses, whatever it is, they all contribute to allostatic load. Over time, we can only sustain so many perturbations, right, and changes to that stability via max effort performance before we see allostatic overload. And this is where we start to see changes in cardiorespiratory measures, neuroendocrine responses, immune responses. Like, we just change the system, and we really have a finite amount or ability to tolerate those deviations from stability. What this sees us need to include in our training is that exposure to things that will improve health again. And they are generally things that aren't at the intensity of game speed, of max effort, whatever it is. And they'll all work to bring you back to a state where we can potentially improve performance again in the long term. This is the premise behind low stress periods of training, deloads, changes in the stimulus from the exercise selection. So are we doing things to max effort? Are we doing things with a tempo so we can attempt to deload some of the joints and tissues and resensitize you to volume, improve your work capacity so you can start repeating efforts. This all plays a part so that in the long term you can improve performance. We may need to take a hit in the short term to your 1 rep max strength, so that in the long term we can start to improve performance and far exceed what we did before. All of this comes down to improving your tolerance to stress. If we are generally a little bit healthier and the systems of our body are able to tolerate more stress and are healthier as a whole, then we are going to be able to adapt more in the long term. And at the end of the day, that's the goal, improve performance. So now, the continuum. We're going to look at this and we're going to start to, outline some things and just illustrate what exactly is it, the specific end of the performance end, and what are some things we can do to increase variability of systems and movement to improve health. So down this end, we've got our 1RM, close proximity to failure, the specific movements of our sport. So for the powerlifter, I'm just going to use the powerlifter example because it is the easiest and probably the biggest number of our subscriber base. We've got sagittal bias and extension bias. Some things that we can do to increase variability in the program or potentially improve health would be potentially including some low intensity steady state cardio. That may be a way of improving systemic variability or health by improvement in aerobic markers like resting heart rate, the ability to do more work in a period of time. That would be what we're looking for there. Squat, bench, deadlift, very plane specific to the sagittal plane. What we can do to improve movement options or variability would be exposure to the frontal and transverse planes. Rather than focusing on 1RM and close proximity to failure, we might be doing things more 5, 6 RPE. We might be doing things that are in higher rep ranges from 8 to 30 potentially. Things that aren't what we've been doing in the specific training blocks. We might be moving things that take us away from those extension biases. If we think of a squat, for example, we might be focusing more goblet positions, more SSB, more front rack to bias us towards flexion. Rather than a bench press, we might be doing hook lying variations where we bias towards that rib down position, that relative posterior tilt with a full reach. If we think of a deadlift, we might move from conventional deadlift to trap bar. Still got that extension stress, but we are biasing more towards flexion. Now, one of the biggest challenges in sports performance training and biological adaptation is our ability to tolerate monotony. Some lifters and some athletes may be able to tolerate the same training way better than others. Some are more prone to being a little bit bored with their training or getting bored with their training. So doing highly specific exercises year round may not be it. We may need a dose specificity, so have those specific exercises but improve or decrease monotony by exposing them to a bit more variance in their training modalities, whether it's by doing a little bit of cardio, whether it's by doing circuits, whether it's by exposing them to tri-sets, different movements overall. That may be our way to improve their, adherence to the program, their buy-in to the program, and just sustain performance over the long term. When can we start to bias programs towards this end of the spectrum? The answer really is, we'll have some phases of training where we'll bias a little bit more variability and health-focused training modalities. The real answer is, at the end of the day, this is a continuum. So there will always be exercise that bias a bit of variability in specific training blocks and vice versa. There will always be a degree of specificity in some of our training blocks for a sports performance athlete, just with a bit more bias towards the variability into the spectrum. So there's no direct answer that this is a period where we focus on specificity and variability. There'll always be bits of the other sprinkled in the other, if that makes sense. We're going to look at the example of the powerlifter in a comp block. A lot of our powerlifters will have their competition focused lift for the day. Top single at an 8, very specific. Back off threes at a 7 to 8. They'll have their secondary lifts, generally a technical focus of one of the big lifts. They'll have their tempo bench, 3x4 at a 7-8 repeat. So quite a high or close proximity to failure. Then we've got an accessory exercise, being the seated leg curl. Here is how we dose a little bit of variability in exercise, almost like a reset. We've got an active bear plank, which biases a bit more flexion and some breathing there to decrease some of that tone in the extensors, facilitate some muscles that just draw us towards that flexion bias position. And our D2, hook line alternating dumbbell press, focusing on a bit more of that frontal plane, transverse plane, a bit of rotation, a bit of a reach, biasing that flexion position. If we want to try and dose a little bit more, a bit of cardio in there, we're going to have some 60-second rests here. Have a bit of a cardiovascular stimulus as well as that reset there as well. Nice bit of mindful movement to close off a session, and really good for a lot of our lifters. Finish up a session, do a bit of that. They generally say after it, they're feeling pretty damn good. After a session like that, to feel pretty good is a rarity. If we can get them feeling a little bit better before they leave, that's a big positive. So what we can see from this D series is we're still dosing in a little bit of that movement variability end of the spectrum, a little bit of our health-focused exercises, and in the long term, it's probably going to help our lifters repeat and sustain performance throughout a comp block. I think this is pretty important. It's not enough to detract from their performance, it's just enough to make them feel good and leave the sessions feeling a little bit better than they would if they didn't do it. Now, the example of a block that is biased a bit more towards systemic and movement variability and health, towards the other side of the continuum, would be this. This would be our example of a block, potentially post-competition block, focusing on more metabolic factors, improvement of energy transfer capability. For here, it's more about the movement and the exercise selection that we're going to be looking at to start. So we've got an SSB squat with heels elevated. The position biases more flexion. It limits the absolute load we can use. We're also doing it for a high amount of reps. Same deal with our hook line and dumbbell press. We're biasing a position that promotes more flexion, gets a bit of a reach, taking us away from the specific position of our bench press. We've got a retracted, depressed, extension biased position. We then have a tricep, so 2 dumbbell B stand to RDL. Forgot to write with a frontal plane bias. So we're positioning our body to bias frontal plane musculature, adductors, glutes or lateral glutes, obliques. We've then got a half kneeling cable row with reach. So we're reaching as we do our row, biasing a bit more transverse plane movement. Then a leg extension with a 1 count pause up to 20 reps. So pushing a bit more of that metabolic end of the hypertrophy spectrum. So if we think about it, we've got mechanical tension and we've got metabolic stress. So we're aiming for that. Not only are we using less absolute load, but it's just driving our ability to transfer energy in the long term and then repeat set performance when we're doing less reps. Now, something that I like to utilize in blocks like this are rest periods. If we look at some of the research that talks about rest periods for biasing hypertrophic outcomes, they're just not necessary because they could potentially limit volume from set to set. In a block or a training session that biases a bit more of that variability or health end of the spectrum, absolute load isn't the focus. It may be some of those energy transfer capabilities. So having some rest periods will not only limit load, but improve our overall fitness. And I think that's probably a good thing to promote health and just aerobic fitness overall. We then finish with a core exercise at the end, again, biasing that flexion-based position, training some of our core musculature, which generally leaves us feeling pretty good before we leave the session. Now, in a block like this is where I might be prescribing some low intensity cardio as well. Usually I go for 1 day of just the steady state modality. So you might choose the air bike, you might choose rower, stepper, anything that has got a low eccentric stimulus. Now, an eccentric stimulus would be like a heavy ground contact as you would see in running. If we're talking about a strength athlete or an individual prioritizing body composition, pulling back eccentric stimulus may be a really good way of just decreasing overall fatigue to make sure that they can back up performances in their lifting days throughout the training week. On the other day, I might have a circuit, a few exercises that bias some of those, I guess, frontal plane, transverse plane positions, a bit more flexion, things that they aren't doing in their training blocks or in their specific training blocks, just to get them feeling good. Every time I give someone a block like this, they end up feeling really good afterwards. And I'll take the anecdotal, subjective evidence from them any day of the week, because at the end of the day, it's how they respond to training. And if they're feeling good, they're probably gonna perform good. Just to close up this video, we understand specificity comes at a cost, but dosing variability through movement, through systemic variability, is the way to sustain performance over the long term. Yes, we know that health markers will drop off as you start to get to those performance-heavy, specific training blocks. But health and performance are not mutually exclusive. You can't have performance without health and vice versa. We just focus on different ends of that continuum to greater degrees depending of the phase of the training block. We hope that these examples gave you a good illustration of how we program at Strength Culture for performance-based goals in the long term. If you have any questions, drop a comment below, DM us. Like, share, and subscribe. And as always, happy lifting.